The courtroom was thick with tension as Judge Walter Grayson prepared to oversee what he assumed would be another routine case. 19-year-old Jalen Dawson stood at the defendant's table, accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. His posture was relaxed, hands in his pockets, chin slightly lifted, not the stance of a guilty man but of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The spectators whispered among themselves, some amused, others curious, as the judge leaned back in his chair, eyeing Jalen with a mix of boredom and condescension. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" Grayson's voice carried dry amusement, prompting a few chuckles from the courtroom staff. To them, this was a formality. A young, clueless defendant who would soon be overwhelmed by the prosecution's case. But Jalen remained unfazed. As the prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, presented his argument, listing the so-called irrefutable evidence, the stolen Audi, the fingerprints, the alleged chase, Jalen watched, waiting for the right moment. He had studied cases like this for years, memorizing legal loopholes while others memorized sports statistics. And when his public defender hesitated, he took control. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor," he announced. The courtroom fell silent. Laughter faded, replaced by intrigue. The judge raised an eyebrow, surprised but entertained. In that moment, the balance of power shifted. This wasn't just another case anymore. This was Jalen's moment, and he was about to dismantle the prosecution's argument piece by piece. Jalen Dawson was no ordinary defendant. While most teenagers spent their time playing video games or watching sports, Jalen had been studying the law. His mother, Denise Dawson, worked as a paralegal for over 20 years, and through her, he learned the inner workings of the legal system. Every night he listened to her stories about prosecutors cutting corners, defense attorneys failing their clients, and judges who had already made up their minds before hearing a case. He absorbed everything. By the time he was 14, he could analyze trials better than most law students. Unlike his peers, Jalen didn't just see the courtroom as a place of punishment. He saw it as a battleground for truth. He spent years preparing, not for this exact moment, but for something like it. He knew the rules, the strategies, and the weaknesses of the system. When others underestimated him, he saw an advantage. Now, standing in a courtroom where everyone expected him to fail, he remained calm. He wasn't just defending himself, he was exposing the flaws in a case that had been built on shaky evidence and biased assumptions. His years of quiet preparation were about to pay off in a way no one expected. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Jalen Dawson was not like other defendants. When his public defender, Lisa Thornton, hesitated under the weight of the prosecution's argument, Jalen took control. Without a hint of fear, he placed a steady hand on her arm and calmly stated, "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The words sent a ripple through the courtroom. Murmurs filled the gallery. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up, and even the seasoned prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, let out a sharp laugh. To them, this was a reckless decision, a young man with no formal legal training attempting to take on an experienced prosecutor. Judge Grayson smirked, leaning forward with interest. "You'll what?" he asked, clearly entertained by the audacity of the teenager standing before him. But Jalen didn't waver. His voice was steady, his posture unshaken. He had studied courtrooms his entire life, and he knew exactly what he was doing. In that moment, the dynamic shifted. What had seemed like a routine trial was now something else entirely. The courtroom was no longer laughing. Instead, they were watching, waiting to see what Jalen would do next. And he was about to prove that they had all underestimated him. Jalen Dawson stood firm as the prosecution presented what they believed was airtight evidence. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, confidently stated that Officer Daniel Ruiz had personally seen Jalen behind the wheel of the stolen Audi before his arrest. The claim sounded definitive, and to most in the courtroom it seemed like a solid piece of evidence. But Jalen had spent too many years studying legal cases to overlook the cracks in the story. With calculated precision, he stepped forward. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "I move to dismiss Officer Ruiz's testimony as evidence." A flicker of confusion crossed Carrington's face. The courtroom fell silent, waiting for Jalen's reasoning. Jalen turned to the judge. "The prosecution claims Officer Ruiz saw me in the vehicle, but according to GPS records, Ruiz wasn't even on duty when the chase began." The statement hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Murmurs rippled through the gallery as Jalen let his words settle. Judge Grayson turned to Carrington. "Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs?" Carrington hesitated, and that hesitation was all Jalen needed. The first major crack in the case had appeared, and now the momentum was shifting in his favor. Jalen Dawson knew that the prosecution was relying heavily on forensic evidence, specifically the fact that his fingerprints were found on the stolen Audi's steering wheel. To an untrained eye, this seemed like undeniable proof of guilt. But Jalen had spent years studying legal tactics, and he knew better. Calmly, he turned to the jury. "The prosecution wants you to believe that because my fingerprints were found in the car, I must have stolen it. But let's think about this logically." He paused, letting the jury lean in. "Imagine you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You zip it up, put your hands in the pockets, then return it to the rack. Hours later, someone steals that jacket. Would your fingerprints mean you were the thief?" The jury exchanged glances. Jalen continued, "That's exactly what happened here. The car was parked outside a 7-Eleven before it was stolen. I leaned against it. I touched the door. It was unlocked. A careless moment, but not a crime." Then, turning to the judge, he asked, "Your Honor, was the forensic specialist subpoenaed to testify?" Carrington hesitated before answering. "No." Jalen gave a knowing nod. "So we're expected to trust evidence that hasn't even been questioned in court?" The tension in the courtroom deepened. Another crack had formed in the case against him. Jalen Dawson wasn't finished dismantling the prosecution's case, after exposing the weaknesses in the fingerprint evidence. He turned to something even more damning, an overlooked statement from the actual owner of the stolen Audi. "Your Honor," Jalen said, his voice steady, "I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the vehicle." Judge Grayson frowned. "The owner?" Jalen nodded. "Yes. Mr. Whitaker gave a statement to the police the night his car was stolen, but for some reason it was never included in the prosecution's filings." He turned to Carrington. "Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told officers?" Carrington's expression tightened, but Jalen didn't wait for an answer. He pulled out a printed transcript and read aloud. "I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously. The gallery gasped. Jalen held up the paper. "The prosecution conveniently ignored this statement. They arrested me, even though I don't match the suspect's description." For the first time, Carrington had no immediate response. The foundation of his case was crumbling. Jalen Dawson had exposed flaw after flaw in the prosecution's case, but the biggest revelation had just shaken the courtroom. The car's owner had described a different suspect. Now all eyes were on the prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, who was struggling to regain control. "The defendant was found in possession of the vehicle," Carrington argued, his voice tight with frustration. "That alone?" Jalen shook his head. "No, I wasn't." He let his words settle before stepping forward. "I was arrested blocks away, walking home with my friends after getting snacks. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't even near the car. The only reason I'm here is because I happened to be in the same area when the police showed up." The gallery murmured. The jury shifted. Jalen's voice remained calm but firm, The real suspect got away, but the officers found a black teenager nearby and decided that was close enough. Silence filled the courtroom. Judge Grayson let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. He had assumed this case would be an easy conviction. Now he realized it was built on bias, assumptions, and sloppy police work. Jalen turned to the jury, his final words hitting hard. This case isn't about evidence, it's about who the system chooses to believe. And in that moment, everyone knew. The system had been wrong. The courtroom was no longer a place of confidence for the prosecution. What had seemed like an open and shut case had unraveled before everyone's eyes. Jalen Dawson had systematically dismantled every piece of evidence used against him, exposing false testimony, weak forensic evidence, and a key witness statement that had been ignored. Now it was time for the final decision. Judge Grayson exhaled, glancing between the prosecution and the jury. He had started this trial assuming Jalen was just another young defendant who had made a mistake. But now, he saw the truth. Jalen wasn't just fighting for himself. He was exposing the flaws in a system that too often made assumptions rather than seeking facts. Grayson tapped his gavel lightly. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" Carrington, now visibly tense, shook his head. "No, Your Honor." The judge nodded, looking at Jalen one last time before speaking the words that would change everything. "Case dismissed." For a moment there was stunned silence. Then chaos erupted. Reporters scrambling, the gallery whispering, disbelief and relief filling the room. But Jalen didn't react. He had known the truth all along. And now, so did everyone else. Outside the courthouse, the air buzzed with excitement. Reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Voices overlapped with rapid-fire questions. "Jalen, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor?" But Jalen wasn't interested in the spectacle. He pulled his hoodie over his head, ignoring the chaos around him. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. It was about justice, about exposing the truth in a system that had already decided he was guilty before the trial even began. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, his mother, Denise Dawson, stood waiting. Arms crossed, expression unreadable, she simply watched as he approached. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally she exhaled, shaking her head. "Boy, you scared me half to death." Jalen chuckled, scratching the back of his head. "Had to take a risk, Ma." She studied him for another second before pulling him into a tight hug. "You always were the stubborn one." The cameras kept flashing, the crowd still buzzing. But Jalen wasn't focused on them anymore. He had already won the battle that mattered most. Across the street, Judge Grayson stood by his car, watching the scene unfold. His posture was different now, no longer arrogant, no longer amused. There was something else in his expression. Reflection, recognition, maybe even regret. He had thought this case was routine, just another day in court, another young defendant to convict. But now he knew better. Jalen Dawson had done something most people never could. He had forced the system to look at itself. And for once, the system had blinked first. How many other cases had played out just like this? How many defendants had been convicted, not because of real evidence, but because of bias, assumptions, and shortcuts? Jalen had the knowledge to fight back, but what about those who didn't? This wasn't just about one case. It was about all of them. It was about a system that cared more about closing cases than finding the truth. And if Jalen could be wrongfully accused, then so could anyone. As he stood outside the courthouse, Jalen knew exactly what he had to do next. This wouldn't be the last courtroom he stepped into. But next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney. Jalen Dawson had won his case, but he knew his fight wasn't over. The courtroom had nearly swallowed him whole, not because he was guilty, but because the system had been designed to assume he was. He had managed to expose the cracks in the prosecution's case. But what about the people who couldn't? What about those who didn't have the knowledge, the confidence, or the chance to fight back? As he walked away from the courthouse, he wasn't just thinking about himself. He was thinking about the countless others who had been wrongfully accused, who had taken plea deals out of fear, who had been convicted not by evidence, but by bias. He had seen firsthand how easily the system could fail someone who didn't know how to defend themselves. He wasn't going to let that happen again. Jalen had always loved the law. He had studied it out of curiosity, out of admiration for the way justice was supposed to work. But now, it was personal. He wasn't just going to learn the law, he was going to use it. One day, he would return to the courtroom. But next time, he wouldn't be standing at the defendant's table. He'd be standing at the defense table, fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The story of Jalen Dawson carries a powerful message about justice, resilience, and the importance of knowledge. Too often, people are judged not by facts, but by assumptions. The legal system, like many aspects of life, can be flawed, shaped by bias and convenience rather than truth. Jalen's story reminds us that understanding our rights, questioning authority when necessary, and standing up for ourselves are crucial, regardless of age or background. For older generations, this lesson is especially important. Many have witnessed injustices over the years, whether in courtrooms, workplaces, or daily life. The world may change, but fairness should never be optional. Jalen's courage teaches us that speaking up, even when the odds are against us, can create real change. More importantly, his journey highlights the value of lifelong learning. No matter how old we are, knowledge remains our greatest tool. Staying informed, understanding how systems work, and passing that wisdom to younger generations can empower them to navigate life's challenges. Justice isn't just about laws, it's about people demanding fairness. Jalen won his battle, but his lesson is for all of us. If we don't question injustice, who will?